Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the systematic killing of American citizens by federal agents in their own neighborhoods represents not a breakdown in law enforcement protocols, but rather the deliberate implementation of a strategy designed to terrorize local communities into submission? And what if I told you that the federal subpoenas now being served on democratically elected governors, mayors, and attorneys general mark the beginning of the most comprehensive assault on local governance in American history? On January 24th, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents shot and killed Alex Preddy during what officials described as routine enforcement operations in Minneapolis. 3 days later, federal agents shot and killed Renee Macklin Good under circumstances that remain deliberately obscured by Department of Homeland Security classification protocols. These were not isolated incidents or operational accidents. These were the predictable outcomes of what Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has publicly characterized as wartime operations, requiring wartime recruitment of personnel specifically selected for their comfort with violence. The targeting is not random. Both Preddy and Good lived in communities whose elected leadership has publicly opposed federal immigration enforcement operations. Both were killed in jurisdictions where local officials have implemented sanctuary policies or refused to cooperate with IC detention requests. The geographic pattern of these killings corresponds precisely with a map of Democratic-controlled cities that the Trump administration has designated as priority targets for what internal documents describe as compliance operations. The federal response to these killings reveals the strategic intent behind them. Rather than conducting transparent investigations or implementing accountability measures, the Department of Justice has launched what amounts to a legal siege against the very officials whose constituents are being killed. Federal prosecutors have issued subpoenas to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, St. Paul Mayor Kaohly Herr, State Attorney General Keith Ellison, and Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty. The stated purpose of these subpoenas is to investigate whether Democratic officials blocked ICE from rounding up undocumented immigrants. This represents a fundamental inversion of constitutional governance. Federal agents kill American citizens, and rather than investigate the agents, the federal government investigates the local officials who represent those citizens. The message being sent is unmistakable. Local resistance to federal operations will result in the death of your constituents and the criminalization of your governance. The legal theory underlying these subpoenas reveals the breadth of the administration's assault on federalism. The Department of Justice is arguing that any action by local officials that impedes federal immigration enforcement constitutes obstruction of justice, even when those actions are explicitly authorized by state law and local ordinances. This interpretation would effectively criminalize the 10th Amendment, making it a federal crime for state and local governments to exercise their constitutional authority over matters not specifically delegated to the federal government. The recruitment campaigns that have produced agents willing to kill civilians in their homes represent perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this strategy. Internal ICE documents obtained through congressional oversight reveal that the agency has specifically sought personnel from military combat units, private military contractors, and what recruitment materials describe as firearms enthusiasts. The stated goal is to identify candidates who possess decisive action capability and demonstrate growing comfort with kinetic operations. This is not the language of law enforcement. This is the language of military occupation. The distinction matters because it reveals the conceptual framework within which these operations are being planned and executed. When federal officials describe immigration enforcement as warfare, requiring component kinetic operations, they are explicitly rejecting the legal and procedural constraints that govern civilian law enforcement in favor of the rules of engagement that apply to military operations against enemy combatants. The constitutional implications extend far beyond immigration enforcement. The principle being established through these operations is that federal agencies can use lethal force against any American citizens whose local governments fail to cooperate with federal priorities. If ICE can kill residents of Minneapolis because the mayor refuses to cooperate with immigration enforcement, there's no legal barrier preventing other federal agencies from employing similar tactics against residents of cities that refuse to cooperate with federal gun policies, environmental regulations, or voting procedures. The targeting of elected officials through federal subpoenas represents an equally dangerous precedent. The investigation of Governor Walz and the other Minnesota officials is based on the theory that state and local governments have no right to limit their cooperation with federal agencies, even when federal operations violate state constitutional protections or local ordinances. This theory, if accepted by federal courts, would effectively eliminate state and local sovereignty by making any disagreement with federal priorities a potentially criminal act. The broader pattern of federal intimidation extends beyond Minnesota to encompass what appears to be a coordinated campaign against democratic governance structures throughout the country. Federal agents have conducted high-visibility operations outside schools, community centers, and other locations specifically chosen for their symbolic importance to local communities. The timing and location of these operations suggest careful coordination with political objectives rather than operational necessities. The recruitment of personnel for these operations has followed patterns that mirror historical examples of state violence against civilian populations. ICE's 100 million wartime recruitment campaign has specifically targeted individuals with experience in military special operations, private security, and what agency documents describe as constitutional militia organizations. The psychological profiles being sought emphasize mission commitment over procedural compliance, indicating a deliberate preference for agents willing to prioritize orders over legal constraints. The training protocols developed for these operations have been classified at levels typically reserved for military counterinsurgency programs. Congressional investigators who have attempted to review these materials have been informed that they involve sensitive operational methodologies that cannot be disclosed even to elected representatives with appropriate security clearances. This classification scheme effectively places federal law enforcement operations beyond democratic oversight, creating what amounts to a secret police force operating with military authorities but without military accountability structures. The legal justifications being offered for these operations rely on expansive interpretations of federal authority that would have been considered constitutionally unthinkable prior to the current administration. Department of Justice legal opinions argue that federal agencies possess inherent constitutional authority to employ whatever force is necessary to ensure compliance with federal law, regardless of state and local legal protections. This interpretation would effectively nullify the constitutional limitations on federal power that have defined American governance since the founding. The international implications of these operations cannot be ignored. The systematic use of lethal force against civilian populations by federal agents, combined with the criminalization of local democratic governance, places the United States in violation of multiple international treaties governing the treatment of civilian populations. Human rights organizations have begun documenting these operations using the same methodologies typically applied to authoritarian regimes that employ state violence to suppress political opposition. The economic dimensions of this campaign reveal additional strategic objectives. The communities being targeted for the most intensive federal operations are predominantly those with strong economic ties to international trade, technology sectors, and educational institutions. The disruption of normal life in these communities serves not just political objectives, but also economic ones, potentially driving business investment toward communities more aligned with federal priorities. The media strategy surrounding these operations has been carefully crafted to normalize the use of lethal force against civilian populations. Official statements consistently describe victims as threats or suspects, even when no criminal charges have been filed and no weapons have been recovered. This linguistic framework prepares public opinion for the expansion of these operations by creating the impression that civilian casualties are the inevitable result of criminal resistance, rather than the predictable outcome of military-style operations in civilian environments. The technological infrastructure supporting these operations has been developed with capabilities that extend far beyond immigration enforcement. ICE has deployed facial recognition systems, cell phone tracking technologies, and surveillance capabilities that provide real-time intelligence on the political activities, social networks, and daily routines of entire communities. This infrastructure creates the technical foundation for comprehensive social control that could be rapidly expanded to target other forms of political opposition. The timing of this escalation corresponds with other indicators of democratic breakdown that suggest a coordinated strategy rather than spontaneous enforcement enthusiasm. The issuance of federal subpoenas to Minnesota officials occurred simultaneously with similar investigations launched against Democratic officials in other states, suggesting central coordination rather than local initiative. The classification of training materials, recruitment criteria, and operational procedures has followed patterns typically associated with preparations for large-scale domestic operations rather than routine law enforcement. The historical parallels are unmistakable and should be deeply disturbing to anyone familiar with the processes through which democratic governments transform into authoritarian systems. The use of federal agents to kill civilians in communities that resist central authority, combined with the criminalization of local democratic governance, represents a classic pattern of authoritarian consolidation. The recruitment of personnel specifically selected for their willingness to use violence against civilian populations, combined with the classification of operational procedures to prevent democratic oversight, completes the institutional framework necessary for systematic political repression. The ultimate objective of these operations appears to be the elimination of local democratic autonomy through the application of federal violence and legal intimidation. Communities that resist federal priorities face the killing of their residents and the prosecution of their leaders. Communities that comply are rewarded with federal resources and protection from enforcement operations. This creates a systematic incentive structure that rewards political submission and punishes democratic resistance. As we observe these developments, we are witnessing not the enforcement of immigration law, but the implementation of a comprehensive strategy to eliminate the constitutional constraints on federal power. The deaths of Alex Preddy, Renee Macklin Good, and others represent not tragic accidents, but deliberate demonstrations of federal willingness to kill American citizens who live in communities that resist central authority. The investigations of Democratic officials represent not legitimate oversight, but the criminalization of constitutional governance. The choice facing American communities is becoming increasingly clear. They can surrender their democratic autonomy in exchange for protection from federal violence, or they can resist and face the systematic targeting of their residents and the prosecution of their leaders. This is not a choice that should exist in a constitutional democracy. It is the choice that has historically faced populations living under military occupation. The infrastructure of repression is being constructed systematically and deliberately. The legal foundations are being established through expansive interpretations of federal authority. The operational capabilities are being developed through classified training programs and specialized recruitment. The political justifications are being normalized through carefully crafted media campaigns. What remains to be determined is whether American democratic institutions possess sufficient strength to resist this transformation, or whether we are witnessing the final phase of a constitutional system that has already been fatally undermined. The answer to that question will depend not on the intentions of federal officials, but on the willingness of American communities to recognize that their fundamental choice is no longer between different policies or parties, but between democratic governance and authoritarian rule. The killings will continue. The investigations will expand. The infrastructure of repression will be completed. Unless the systematic nature of what is occurring is recognized and resisted, the transformation will be irreversible. The time for treating these developments as isolated incidents or policy disagreements has passed. What we are witnessing is the deliberate destruction of American democracy through the application of state violence against civilian populations and the criminalization of democratic governance itself.